Swami Vivekananda and the Order of Ramakrishna. It was amongst the lawns and trees of the Ganges side that I came to know in a personal sense the leader to whose work my life was already given. At the time of my landing in India on 28th January 1898, the ground and building had just been purchased at Balua, which were afterwards to be transformed into the Calcutta monastery of the Order of Ramakrishna. A few weeks later still, a party of friends arrived from America, and with characteristic intrepidity took possession of the half-ruined cottage to make it simply but pleasantly habitable. It was as the guest of the feast friends here at Balur, and later, traveling in Kumaon and Kashmir, that I began with them the study of India, and something also of the home aspects and relationships of the Swami's own life. Our cottage stood on a low terrace built on the western bank of the river, a few miles above Calcutta. At flood tide, the little gondola-like boat, which to those who live beside the Ganges serves the purpose of a carriage, could come up to the very foot of the steps, and the river between us and the opposite village was from half to 3/4 of a mile broad. A mile or so further up the eastern bank could be seen the towers and trees of Dakshineswar, that temple garden in which the Swami and his brothers had once been boys at the feet of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. The house, which was in actual use at that time as the monastery, lay some half-mile or so to the south of our cottage, and between us and it were several other garden houses, and at least one ravine crossed by a doubtful-looking plank made out of half of the stem of a palm tree. To our cottage here, then, came the Swami daily at sunrise, alone or accompanied by some of his brothers. And here, under the trees, long after our early breakfast was ended, we might still be found seated, listening to that inexhaustible flow of interpretation, broken but rarely by question and answer, in which he would reveal to us some of the deepest secrets of the Indian world. I am struck afresh whenever I turn back upon this memory by the wonder as to how such a harvest of thought and experience could possibly have been garnered, or how, when once ingathered, could have come such energy of impulse for its giving forth. Amongst brilliant conversationalists, the Swami was peculiar in one respect. He was never known to show the slightest impatience at interruption. He was by no means indifferent as to the minds he was addressing. His deepest utterances were heard only in the presence of such listeners as brought a subtle sympathy and reverence into the circle about him. But I do not think he was himself aware of this, and certainly no external circumstance seemed to have power to ruffle him. Moods of storm and strength there were in plenty, but they sprang like those of sweetness from hidden sources. They were entirely general and impersonal in their occasion. It was here that we learnt the great outstanding watchwords and ideals of the Indian striving. For the talks were above all an exposition of ideals. Facts and illustrations were gathered, it is true, from history, from literature, and from 1,000 other sources. But the purpose was always the same, to render some Indian ideal of perfection clear. Nor were these ideals always so comprehensible as might have been supposed. This was a world in which concentration of mind was the object of more deliberate cultivation than even the instincts of benevolence could require. But the time was not yet come in which this was to be argued as for or against India. The attainment of the impersonal standpoint was boldly proposed in matters personal. Be the witness was a command heard often, that which bids us pray for our enemies. The idea of recognizing an enemy would have seemed to this mind a proof of hatred. Love was not love, it was insisted, unless it was without a reason or without a motive, as a Western speaker might have attempted, though perhaps with less force, to express the same idea. Purity and renunciation were analyzed untiringly. The great God tempted by nothing, not kingship, not fatherhood, not wealth nor pleasure. In all the worlds the Lord had created, proving on the contrary, in matters worldly, a very simple fellow, incurious, easily deceived, and begging his daily handful of rice from door to door, shone through all our dreams. Non-correction of evil was a mark of the religious life, and of this we might find a Western example in that monk who was a leper, and who, when the maggots fell from his finger joints, stooped and replaced them, saying, "Eat, brothers." The vision of Raghunath was one of the perfections of the soul, and that saint had had it who fainted when the bullocks were beaten in his presence, while on his back were found the wheels made by the lash. We were even called upon to understand a thought immeasurably foreign to all our past conceptions of religion, in which sainthood finds expression in an unconsciousness of the body, so profound that the saint is unaware that he goes naked. For that delicate discrimination of a higher significance in certain cases of nudity, which in Europe finds its expression in art, in India it finds it in religion. As we, in the presence of a Greek statue, experience only reverence for the ideal of beauty, so the Hindu sees in the naked saint only a glorified and childlike purity. There was one aspiration, however, which was held in this new thought world to be of the same sovereign and universal application in the religious life as that of the concentration of mind. This was the freedom of the individual soul, including all the minor rights of thought and opinion and action. Here lay the one possession that the monk was jealously to guard as his own, the one property on which he must brook the foot of no intruder. And as I watched the working out of this in daily life, I saw that it amounted to a form of renunciation. To accept nothing, however pleasant, if it concealed a fetter. At a word, to stand ready to sever any connection that gave a hint of bondage. How clear must be the mind that would do this, how pure the will. And yet this ideal too was eloquent of many things. One could not help seeing that it accounted for the comparative non-development of monasticism in India, for the fact that the highest types of the religious life in the past had been solitary, whether as hermits or wanderers. In the monastery beside us there were men, as we were told, who did not approve of their leaders talking with women. There were others who objected to all rites and ceremonies. The religion of one might be described as atheism tempered by hero worship. That of another led him to a round of practices which to most of us would constitute an intolerable burden. Some lived in a world of saints, visions, and miracles. Others again could not sway away with such nonsense, but must needs guide themselves by the coldest logic. The fact that all these could be bound together in a close confraternity bore silent witness to their conception of the right of the soul to choose its own path. It also, as I could not help thinking, both then and after, accounted for the failure in certain respects of the old Indian forms of authority. For in order that the highest and most disinterested characters may throw themselves into the work of the city and the state, it is surely necessary that they should sincerely hold the task of such organization to be the highest and most honorable which they could aspire to carry out. In the India of the past, however, the best men had been too conscious of the more remote spiritual ideals and amongst them of this conception of freedom, to be capable of such an enthusiasm for the assertion of the civic and national discipline. And we cannot wonder that, in spite of the existence of ability and character, certain advantages of the modern system have thus been left for the moderns to demonstrate. That Hinduism, nevertheless, is capable enough of adding to her development that of the inspiration and sustenance of such activities is shown, as I believe, in the very fact of the rise of Ramakrishna and his disciple Vivekananda, with their characteristic contribution to the national thought. It was perhaps an instance of that exchange of ideals which he had ever in mind, that the Swami gravely warned us again and again, as a great fault of the Western character, against making any attempt to force upon others that which we had merely found to be good for ourselves. And yet, at the same time, when asked by some of his own people what he considered, after seeing them in their own country, to be the greatest achievement of the English, he answered, that they had known how to combine obedience with self-respect. But it was not the Swami alone whom we saw at Vellore. We were accounted by the monastery as a whole as its guests. So back and forth would toil the hospitable monks on errands of kindness and service for us. They milked the cow that gave us our supply, and when the servant whose duty it was at nightfall to carry the milk was frightened by the sight of a cobra in the path and refused to do it again, it was one of the monks themselves who took his place in this humble office. Some novice would be deputed daily to deal with the strange problems of our Indian housekeeping. Another was appointed to give Bengali lessons. Visits of ceremony and of kindness were frequently paid us by the older members of the community. And finally, when Swami Vivekananda himself was absent for some weeks on a journey, his place was always duly taken at the morning tea table by someone or another who felt responsible for the happiness of the guests. In these and 1,000 similar ways, we came in touch with those who could reveal to us the shining memory that formed the warp and woof which were woven through our lives of renunciation. For they had only one theme, these monastic visitors of ours, and that was their master, Sri Ramakrishna, and his great disciple, Vivekananda. The Swami had now been back with them for 13 or 14 months, and scarcely yet had they recovered from their first pleasure and surprise. Before that, he had been practically lost to them for some 6 years. It was true that of late he had corresponded with them freely, and that for no time had they been long altogether off his track. And yet, when his first success in America had been heard of, most of his brethren had only their confidence in the great mission foretold by his master to tell them that it was he. Those who have witnessed here or there some great life of asceticism will recognize a mood of passionate longing to lose one's own identity, to be united with the lowliest and most hidden things, to go forth from amongst men, and to be no more remembered by them as an element in the impulse of renunciation. This it is which explains, as I think, the long silence and seclusion in caves, the garb of mud and ashes so often worn as a man wanders from forest to forest and village to village, and 1,000 other features of this type of religion, which to the Western onlooker might seem inexplicable. This mood would seem to have been much with the Swami in the early years after the passing of his master. And again he must have left a little band of brethren in the hope never to be heard of more. Once he was brought back from such an expedition by the community itself, who heard that he was lying ill at a place called Hathras, and sent to take him home. For such was the love that bound them all to each other, and especially to him, that they could not rest without nursing him themselves. A few months later, he was followed to the monastery by a disciple whom he had called to himself during his wanderings. This man's name in religion was Sadananda, and from his account, with its strong broken English, I gleaned the record of the life that was lived at this period in the monastery. When he arrived, it had taken him some 2 or 3 months, by means of railway service, to earn his way to Calcutta from his old home. He found the Swami on the point of setting out once more. But for his sake this journey was abandoned, and the departure that was to have taken place that evening did not occur till 12 months later. He told me, "The Swami's mission began with me." During this year, he, the master, would work 24 hours at a time. He was a lunatic like, he was so busy, Sadananda told me. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, he would rise and call the others, singing, "Awake, awake, all ye who would drink of the divine nectar." Then all would proceed to meditation, afterwards drifting almost unconsciously into singing and talking, which would last till noon. From hymns and chanting they would pass into history. Sometimes it would be the story of Ignatius Loyola, or Joan of Arc, or Rani of Jhansi. And yet again the Swami would recite long passages from Carlyle's French Revolution, and they would all sway themselves backwards and forwards dreamily, repeating together, "Viva la Republique!" Or the subject of their reveries might be St. Francis of Assisi, and with the same unconscious instinct of the dramatist, they would lose themselves in an endless identification with his "Welcome, Sister Death." It might perhaps be 1 or 2 in the afternoon when Ramakrishna Ananda, the cook and housekeeper and ritualist of the community, would drive them all with threats to bathe and eat. But after this they would again group and again would go on and with song and talk till late in the evening, bringing with it the time for the 2 hours of arati to Sri Ramakrishna. As often as not, even this would scarcely break the absorption. Again would follow song and talk of the Master, and again would come the trances of meditation. Or on the roof till long after midnight, it might be, they would sit and be silent for a while, and then chant, "Hail Sita Rama." The special festivals of all religions brought each other special forms of celebration. At Christmas time, for instance, they would recline with long shepherd's crooks around a lighted log and talk in low tones of the coming of the angels to the lonely watchers by their flocks and the singing of the world's first Gloria. Very curious is the story of how they kept Good Friday. Hour after hour had gone by, and they had risen gradually to that terrible exaltation of spirit which comes to those who give themselves to that day. Food was not to be thought of, but they had contrived to have by them a few grapes, and the juice was squeezed out and mixed with water, to be drunk out of a single cup by all. In the midst of such scenes, the voice of a European was heard at the door, calling on them in the name of Christ. With inexpressible delight they swarmed down on him, 12 men of them eager to hear of the day from the lips of a Christian. But he said he belonged to the Salvation Army and knew nothing about Good Friday. They only kept General Booth's birthday and something else, said Sadananda. And in the cloud that overcast the face and voice of the teller, one could realize the sudden depression that fell at this discovery upon the monks. It seems that in their first disappointment they snatched his Bible from the unfortunate missionary, saying he was not worthy to possess it, and drove him forth. It is said, however, that one of their number stole round by another door and brought him back to eat and have his property secretly restored to him. As Sadananda continued, he said those were hot days. He had quite a glow on his face when he said that. There was no minute of rest. Outsiders came and went, pundits argued and discussed. But he, the Swami Vivekananda, was never for one moment idle, never dull. Sometimes he was left alone for a while, and he would walk up and down saying, Hari Bol, Bol, Bol. Call on the Lord, call, call. Or, oh, Mother. In all these ways, preparing himself for his great work. And I watched all the time from a distance, and in some interval said, Sir, will you not eat? Always to be answered playfully. Sometimes the talk took place while cooking was going on, or during the service of the altar, offices in which all shared without distinction. For in spite of the poverty of those days, many came to the monks to be fed. Their own resources were scanty. They had only one piece of cloth amongst them that was good enough to be worn across the shoulders outside the monastery. So this was kept on a line and used by anyone who went out, and they could afford no more. Yet food was found somehow for the poor and for guests, and many came for help or teaching. They begged funds enough also to buy and distribute some hundreds of copies of the Bhagavad Gita and the Imitation of Christ, the two favorite books of the order at that time. Silence, all ye teachers, and silence, ye prophets. Speak thou alone, O Lord, unto my soul. Was years after a sentence that the Swami quoted at a venture as all that he remembered of Thomas à Kempis. For it is perhaps needless to say that while this book took its place by degrees amongst experiences remembered, the Gita grew every day in fullness of power and beauty in the minds of these Hindu children of Ramakrishna. So passed some 12 months. And the Swami went away to Gazipur to visit Parhari Baba, that saint whom he always held second only to Ramakrishna. He came back in a couple of months to share the treasure he had gained with others. Suddenly news came that one of the brothers by the name of Yogananda was lying ill with smallpox at Allahabad, and a party followed by the Swami started to nurse him. At Allahabad, to take up once more Sadananda's account, many days were passed in religious education. It was as if Yogananda's sickness had been a mere incident, a call given through him, and the whole town came and went in a great stirring. Small groups would enter and leave in a constant succession for days and nights together, the Swami being always in his highest and greatest mood. On one occasion he saw a Mohammedan saint, a Paramahansa, whose every line and curve told that he was a Paramahansa, and this was the occasion of a great hour. Sometimes naked, sometimes mad, now as a scholar, again as a fool, here a rebel, there a saint. Thus they appear on the earth, the Paramahansas. So repeating the marks of the Paramahansa from the Viveka Chudamani of Shankaracharya, there passed, as the disciple would put it, a whole night of fermenting in the spirit. Such experiences lasted perhaps for 2 weeks, and then the party left Allahabad, and by twos and threes returned to the monastery in the village of Baranagar on the banks of the Ganges. But now there came a time in the year 1890 when the Swami left his brothers, not to return until the great triumph of the year 1897. This time he set out with a monk known as Akananda, who took him to Almora and left him there, enjoying the hospitality of a family who had formerly befriended himself on a journey to Tibet. It is said that on the way up the mountains the Swami one day fainted with hunger, when a poor Mohammedan found him and prepared and gave him a cucumber, which practically saved his life. How long the brothers had been without food I do not know. It may have been that at this time, as certainly later, he was under the vow to ask for nothing, waiting always for food and drink till they were offered. He told someone who knew him during that period and questioned him that the longest time he had ever gone without food under this austerity was 5 days. After this, the thread of his wanderings was lost. He wrote occasionally, but the monks themselves were scattered. It had been so dull after they lost him, and even the first home had to be abandoned, for the landlord talked of rebuilding. There was one monk, however, Ramakrishna Ananda by name, who would not leave the ashes of their master, but vowed with rock-like determination to keep a roof overhead, come storm, come shine, so to speak, for them and for his brothers, till they should all foregather in their worship-room once more. He then, with Nirmalananda, the occasional resident, and one Premananda, and the new member of the fold, a dishwasher, removed to a house some distance away, but still in the immediate neighborhood of Dakshineswar. And the monastery which had previously been at Baranagore was now known as the Alabazar Muth.